All right there, guys. How are you doing? As you can see, I've done away with the usual outfit. We're in a sort of a classic Swiss circa 2018 attire today. I'm here to talk about and potentially answer the question: can reform win the next general election? Now, depending on where you are on this topic already, you may be thinking, my goodness, Swiss, hang on a minute. We've heard about a couple of polls that have come out lately, but hold your horses here. How many MPs have they got? 4, 5, something like that. Um, and also, before I jump into this as well, I will mention the nominations for the Milky Awards are open. Go check out the previous stream on the channel. There's a link in there. You've got until Friday next week to nominate. So, can reform win the next general election? Well, I'm afraid I'm not going to get round to answering that just yet. We've got to wade through all the theory first. Um, in this recent general election just gone, we had Labour get in with a pretty darn sizable majority. But of course, there's that asterisk next to it where we go, it was a very large majority, but it was on a low vote share. Certainly a low vote share relative to any party in this country winning a majority for that matter. And we've ascribed sort of elements of Labour winning to, yes, in opposition, they presented themselves as, we can govern, we're sensible, we're grown-ups, whatever. But a large part of it also was to do with the Tories imploding, especially over the course of the last Parliament. Boris Johnson Partygate, Liz Truss, failing to tackle small boat crossings, whatever you want to ascribe to it. But they'd started to lose some of their own natural voter base. And of course, you had the ascendancy of reform, namely the ascendancy of reform with Nigel Farage coming back to helmet. And I think that did make a big difference. We saw a big shot in the arm for reform during the election campaign once it was announced Farage was coming back. So in the election just gone, we had, I guess you could say it's a peculiar election result, but then again, not so much. I'll explain. So we had Labour win a large majority off the basis of not that great a share of the vote, really. What was it, about a third or so? You had to begin with, I want to say it was 5 MPs. That sounds about right. But they came second in vastly, vastly more seats than that. And indeed, they actually got more votes than the Liberal Democrats got. It was the best result for the Liberal Democrats, mind you, as well. The Lib Dems came in with the most MPs they've ever had, but because of first past the post and where you distribute those votes, Reform got more votes, but they ended up with vastly less MPs than the Lib Dems. But in the time since that general election, Labour have dropped off quite dramatically in terms of their support in the polls. They've not had an amazing run of it since they've been in power. As I've sort of said before, I was impressed with how they were doing for the first few weeks. Then it kind of tapered off. Too much messaging on doom and gloom, stuck in the mud with the freebies scandal, two-tier Kia, all of that sort of stuff. And then the fallout from the budget. There were elements of the budget that I very much liked. However, I also accept that there are a number of parts of the budget that have proven quite unpopular with people as well. Not least, you've got farmers out protesting and sort of, the Tories and Reform very much being on side with the farmers there as well. So it's not been an amazing time for Labour while they've been in power so far. The Tories, similar story in a way. A great portion of the time since the last general election has been taken up by the Tories holding their own leadership contest, and it felt like a rather long one. Ultimately, they picked Kemi Badenoch. And Badenoch's been in the role now for just over a month or so. I watched her first PMQs against Starmer, and I was fairly impressed. Snippets that I've seen of subsequent PMQs, I'm beginning to feel maybe it's a little bit more one note, and maybe I was impressed at first, but I wouldn't be in future occasions. I wouldn't say from what I've seen so far that it seems like Kemi Badenoch has had any amazing amount of cut through with the public, or suddenly a bunch of people are rallying and going, "Oh my God, look at this Kemi Badenoch! Wow, what an alternative! We'll come back and vote for the Tories now." Doesn't seem like that's happening thus far. So we're in a situation where we're 6 months into this Parliament so far. The party of government have had a virtually non-existent honeymoon period, and they are proving quite unpopular. The Tory opposition, they've gained a little bit of ground in the polls. I can give them credit for that, but I don't think they're anywhere near where they need to be making it into power anytime soon. Of course, it's also very fair to say that Reform aren't anywhere near where they need to be based on current polling to make it into power either. there's a lot of caveats I need to throw out here by saying, look, this is where we are for 4 or 5 years in the future. Things will change, etc., etc. But this is the argument that I want to lay out here. This is what I believe that the mood music is. Okay, if you have both the incumbent Labour government proving unpopular with the voters and the Tory opposition also proving unpopular with the voters, then that is a recipe for something else to come along in their place. And I think in years gone by, maybe that would have been the Liberal Democrats. I don't think that's going to be the Liberal Democrats in this situation. I think that the demographics of voters who are dissatisfied with Labour and the Tories and might go elsewhere. I think you've got kind of your classic sort of right wingers. You've got people who are part of the Brexit camp for the past few years. You've got quite a lot of working class people. You've even got some who are sort of more, I guess you could say, economically left wing but socially conservative. Now I know what you're saying. Reform, economically left wing, no, but socially conservative. We can tick that box, I suppose. And I think that how do I best want to put this? I think that over the past decade or so, in this country and around the world for that matter, we've seen the rise of populism. We've seen voters making different choices than they had done previously, generally voting against what they perceive as being the establishment, against the status quo, and generally at most opportunities they have to make that kind of a choice, they do so. If you want to cast your mind back to the EU referendum, Brexit was kind of seen as the anti-establishment, more populist type thing. That obviously ended up winning. You want to look at the 2019 general election. Actually, let's talk about the 2017 and 2019 general elections here, because this is interesting, I think. I was thinking about this the other day. Obviously, we had Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party for 2 general elections, 2017 and 2019. Now, some Corbyn supporters out there, I, of course, formally count myself as one of them, might not appreciate me using the phrase populist to describe Jeremy Corbyn and friends, because it's very much a term that tends to be used for the more sort of nationalist rights and that kind of thing. But I think in terms of, in terms of rhetoric, in terms of, an us and them kind of thing, for the many, not the few, for, these elites, these establishment elites, these neoliberal capitalist yada, yada, yadas, we're the ones that are going to come in and change everything up. They've not been listening to you, but we're going to listen to you, etc. That, I feel it's harnessing that same kind of energy almost. Now, you might end up saying, oh, well, Jeremy Corbyn was leader for 2 general elections. How many general elections did he win? People obviously aren't backing the populists quite as commonly as you're saying, Swiss, if he didn't even win the 2 elections. But I'll throw this little caveat in here. He won 2 leadership elections within the Labour Party fold in order to be the leader. And in the 2 general elections that he ran, being the leader of the party, in both of those general elections, Labour actually got more votes. This is an amazing stat, really. Labour got more votes in the 2017 election and the 2019 election than they did in the 2024 general election, which Keir Starmer won with a huge majority. And I think the difference there being, obviously, Starmer was able to target particular kinds of voters in particular kinds of areas, which in the first past the post system, you needed to be able to target in order to win. You also had the situation where Starmer was benefiting from the Tories having been in power for so long and having made so many mistakes. If you think about Partygate, Liz Truss, all of that was post Corbyn and into the election that Starmer ran on. So that probably benefited him as well. But I think you also had the factor in the 2017 and 2019 elections of sort of a pro-Corbyn vote and an anti-Corbyn vote. I think that you did get a large number of voters out to vote for Jeremy Corbyn because they were enthused by him, they were enthused by his platform, they wanted to see some change. And then I think that's in part why you saw such large numbers voting for the Labour Party in terms of the popular vote in those elections. That said, you also had an anti-Jeremy Corbyn vote. You had people who were afraid of him getting into power, people who were afraid that he'd be far too left-wing, too socialist, not appropriate to be prime minister, didn't like his stances on foreign policy, whatever. But you had sort of people on the centre or the right of politics who viewed Corbyn as much of a threat as many people on the left would view your standard Tory or your Nigel Farage as a threat. And as a result, you ended up getting a big column of people voting for him, but then you got an equally large column of people voting specifically to block him. Add into that, muddying the water somewhat, you also had the fact that 2017 and 2019 were the two Brexit elections. So you kind of had an element of the Leave vote and the Remain vote sort of beginning to shift one side or another, who can sort of win over that vote. And in the end, certainly by 2019, Boris Johnson get Brexit done, you had that Leave coalition forming around Johnson and the Tories far more solidly than you had a Remain coalition around Labour. I think it was a bit more evenly split in 2017, but by 2019 it very much moved in that direction. So that's what I want to sort of say as the potential counterpoint, where one may go, oh, well, you're talking about this rise of populism and how successful it is and how everyone keeps voting for it. But one of your examples, Jeremy Corbyn, never won any elections. But I'll say at the very least, well, you know, the two elections he lost, he still got more votes than the election that Labour just won recently. So, you know, in terms of people putting pencils to ballots, then I think that makes the case at the very least. And then speaking of 2019, you obviously had Boris Johnson. Get Brexit done, Boris Johnson. You know, level up Britain, Boris Johnson. And very much inhibiting the rhetoric that the Tories took on, especially towards the latter part of their time in office since 2010, that they don't like the Brussels bureaucrats telling them what to do. They don't like the tofu-eating wokerati trying to enforce their social standards on other people. You know, you know this kind of rhetoric. You've heard enough of it. You remember the sort of waffle that the likes of Liz Truss and that were coming out with as well. You know, Boris Johnson, I think, was definitely able to harness a bit of that populist energy himself. He was definitely one of those types of figures as well, where he could just sort of come along, say virtually anything. It didn't necessarily have to be that true, but it didn't matter if it was that true, because it taps into a feeling. It tapped into an instinct. It tapped into sort of like, oh, yeah, we like the things you're saying. Fuck those other people. Yeah, let's get it done, you know. Especially with Johnson in 2019 trying to frame that election around Brexit, and also the idea of, you know, the blockers, the people trying to stop and prevent Brexit, and again trying to tie it into that sort of establishment kind of feeling. You know, oh, they're all closing ranks and they're trying to undo the thing that everyone voted for in 2016, but vote for me, I'll get it done, I'll get it through, etc. That worked. So in that sense, what I want to say at the very least is, if we look at the mood music of just this country, we had the vote for Brexit in 2016. We had the Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister of a decent majority in 2019. Although Corbyn, as I'm going to call a populist on the left, never made it into power, he still managed to achieve quite a large number of votes, especially relative to Starmer just recently as well. So I think there's definitely something out there. There's definitely a hunger out there in the country still for change, for something that actually really does feel different. Now, of course, I'm not saying that there's overlap one for one between the sorts of people who'd vote for Jeremy Corbyn and the sorts of people who'd vote for Nigel Farage. You've obviously got very different sets of values, very different platforms there. Although I think actually it would be interesting to look at what demographic slice of voters would go from one to the other, because I think they probably do exist out there as well. But no, I'm trying to say in general that if people are being offered a chance to vote for something different and against the establishment, and something that they actually really feel is going to change things, then generally speaking, they do, at least in larger numbers than they have done in other decades gone by. This past 10 years in this country really has set the tone for that. Of course, this isn't a thing that's exclusive to the UK. If you look at elections around the world, if you look at many elections in Europe, if you look at the United States and the one and now two Donald Trump presidencies for that matter as well, I think it does indeed show that seems to be, I keep using this phrase mood music, but I think it suits, you know, that seems to be the zeitgeist almost that we're existing in this past decade, and I don't think that that's over and done with. And that's what I wanted to try and sort of set up here a little bit, because I think it'd be very easy to sort of say, well, look, okay, we voted for Brexit in 2016. sure, but Jeremy Corbyn never won power. Nigel Farage has never won power. It continued to be the Tories for a number of years, and now Labour have got in with a fairly sort of bread and butter. We are Labour. We're going to do a few Labour things, but bit of a boring Keir Starmer-esque platform. Maybe populism just hasn't really happened in this country in the way that it would have done in other countries. To that, I would say, though, I think one key difference between us and, for example, other European countries is the fact that we have our first past the post voting system, whereas many of them have a form of proportional representation, which means it's much, much easier if someone wants to vote for a brand new alternative just to vote for it and to see the effects of that, rather than here you go, all right, then, maybe there are 10 or 20% of people in the country who want to vote for some radically different thing than they've had before. But if they're not able to win the more votes than any other candidate in an individual constituency, then that's not exactly going to register. I mean, hell, look at elections gone by. You can rack up millions of votes for particular parties countrywide and still only end up with one or a small handful of MPs. But look at the election just gone. The election just gone, 2024, has been very interesting. And I come back round to a point I think I started making about 10 minutes ago, which was to say that we've had, since 2010, I'd say, maybe longer, I don't know, we've had a gradual diversifying of which parties people are willing to vote for. You've had the combined vote share of Labour and the Tories dropping, and you've had people, going for the Liberal Democrats or for the Greens or for UKIP or for Reform or for other regional parties or what have you. But we've seen that increasingly. Now, the tide comes in, the tide goes out. Liberal Democrats were doing very well. Then they didn't do so well after the coalition with the Tories. Now they're back again. The SNP had a high watermark after the independence referendum. Now they've fallen back again as well. But there has been that kind of churn. It has shown that more so than before, people are willing to do that. The exceptions to that, I would love to imagine it as a nice straight line to prove my point and say, okay, here's 2010 and here's 2024, and it's just gone all the way like that. But of course, you had the 2017 and 2019 general elections, and those sort of bucked this trend that I'm talking about. But I kind of want to say that they were the exception to this new rule in a sense, because both of them were Brexit elections and both of them were Corbyn elections. And I think that certainly there's a big element that you can't discount in both of those cases of either people voting for a certain party to try and get their preferred version of hard Brexit, soft Brexit, no Brexit, or to get their we want Jeremy Corbyn, we want to stop Jeremy Corbyn getting in at all costs, and those being factors that people vote on as well. Look at the 2024 general election, the first election since 2015 that has not been a Brexit election or a Corbyn election. And what do you have? Well, my God, you've got a greater diversity of people voting for different parties than I think we've probably we've had, at least in my recent political memory. Now, of course, you can say, but Swiss, look, the Labour Party have a huge majority. What's exactly that supposed to say? Surely we'd be getting a hung parliament or something if it was the case that it was truly split that much. Again, that's the quirk of the first past the post system. Labour's able to get a third of the vote and get 2/3 of the seats. That's just the way it currently is. But I think that again does kind of show the point just a little bit. This election just gone, despite the first past the post system, which has done a very good job for very many decades at keeping smaller parties out and the main two big parties in. This past election, you've had a number of independents, not even just people who were previously MPs and then have decided to run as an independent, people who were not pre-existing members of parliament already. You've had a number of independents getting elected. You've had Reform breaking through with their number of MPs. You've had the largest number ever of Liberal Democrat MPs. The Greens, unfortunately for the Greens, still only got one MP, but they still increased their vote share nonetheless. I think the point I'm trying to say here is that in terms of the way that people want to vote or are willing to vote or are happy with not voting for one of the two main parties, it seems that we are in more of a moment for that now in this country than probably we ever have been before. I think that's a fair claim to make, to be honest with you. And perhaps you'd agree. Compare this with 2010, 2015, 2017, 2019, what have you. I think this has been the most diverse in terms of the vote share for various parties, which again shows that people are willing to vote differently, not necessarily backing the two main parties. And I'll go back to my earlier point on populism. Claire King says Greens have 1 MP, they have 4. Greens don't have 4 MPs. What are you on about, Claire? You're making me check this now because you're making me second guess myself. But the Greens haven't got 4. Have they got 4 MPs in the House of Commons? When did they get 4? How did I forget that they had 4? My mistake. My mistake. My bad. I hold my hands up and say silly me on my ignorance on that one. Oh well, that actually proves my point even more than it did before. The Greens have 4 MPs. Reform have 5 MPs. The Liberal Democrats have more than they've ever had before. My bad. My bad. There we are. Okay. That makes my point even more, to be totally honest with you. So why am I saying all this? Why am I coming back around to the original point we're making? Can Reform win the next general election? Well, as I've laid out for you, I think the zeitgeist of populism is still very much strong out there in the country, out in several countries at the moment, and I think that can't be discounted. The willingness for people to vote for parties other than the traditional main two parties, I think, is at the greatest degree it's been in that I can remember. That's worth taking into account also. And I think you need to look at the incumbent party of government, being Labour. You need to look at the main party of opposition, being the Tories. And you need to ask yourselves, in a situation where we get to the end of the Parliament and Labour have proven fairly unpopular, they've not managed to make the changes they wanted to make. Maybe people don't feel that much better off than they were before. Maybe the economy's better, but people don't feel any better than they were before. Think about the USA, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, etc. That's a thing to watch out for. Kerry Badnock in opposition, can she right the ship? Can she stop the Tories from attacking each other like a bunch of cats fighting in a sack or something? Maybe she can. Maybe she can get the Tories as a relatively unified force that are, pretty well disciplined and they're sending their messages out. But can she cut through to the public? Can it undo the feelings the public have about the Tories from their time in office before? Or indeed, do potential Tory voters say to themselves, well, I could go back to voting for the Tories, but some of these things that I want the Tories to do, actually, when they were in power just recently, they didn't do. Or in some cases, they did the opposite of it. The Tories in power since 2010, David Cameron and various other people standing for election saying, oh, we'll get immigration down to the tens of thousands. We'll get it down below 100,000. Did they ever achieve that at any point during their 14 years in power? No, they didn't. But who did you have shouting on the sidelines the entire time about immigration? Oh, you had Nigel Farage. If you want to talk about, lowering and cutting taxes, that being the thing that the Tories are meant to do. Well, again, towards the very tail end, I mean, bless Liz Truss. She did try, but she didn't last very long. But then the tail end, you had Rishi Sunak and friends, this is the highest tax burden since yada, yada, yada of this decade gone by, etc. I'm just thinking that, and I'm not necessarily, this isn't the sort of demographic of voter I belong to, but I'm trying to put myself in their shoes, and I'm trying to say, if these are the sorts of things that you prioritize and that you want to see, you want lower taxes, you want lower immigration, you've had the Tories in for God knows how long, and they just don't seem to achieve those things in the way that you want to. Maybe you were a hardcore Liz Truss supporter, and you really wanted to see her in and implement her policies and succeed at them because you believe in them, and you look at what happened to her and you're like, oh, she was in for a month and a bit and then they ousted her and didn't even consult the membership. That doesn't seem very fair. Or maybe you were a Boris Johnson fan and you liked his rhetoric, you thought he was on your side, you liked the fact that he got Brexit done, and then you go, oh yeah, and the Tories ousted him as well and we didn't necessarily get a say in that. I can understand absolutely why Tory voters or members have been very disenfranchised, with everything that's gone over the past few years, because I think from their perspective, they had certain things that they wanted to see done or certain people that they wanted to back for being in power. And time again, either those things weren't done or the people that they backed were booted out of power without them being consulted. So it makes enough sense to me in a way. I can understand in the past few years why Tories are either just staying at home or indeed now saying that they're going to vote for reform. Now, of course, I'm only talking about, for a catch-all phrase, what I would call the right-wing Tories. Of course, the Tories have also bled out some support to the Lib Dems, because you've kind of had this strange sort of counterintuitive situation where the Tories have lost support to reform for not doing the things that certain right-wing Tory voters want them to do. But then at the same time, in order to try and claim back those voters, the Tories have gone very hard on their rhetoric for saying, yes, we're going to be very, very right-wing and do lots of right-wing things. But then that's kind of turned off some of the more sort of, the more liberally wet One Nation conservatives and going, oh, Rwanda, I don't think we like the sounds of Rwanda. Leaving the European Court of Human Rights, I'm not sure I like that either. Maybe go back for the Lib Dems or something like that. So the Tories have been in a very tricky position here, where they've got sets of voters pulling off in two directions, and if you're going to chase after one of them, you're going to alienate the others. And unfortunately for them, as much as we've seen this at PMQs just this week, Kemi Badenoch went on immigration against Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer's track record in immigration, well, he's only been in 6 months, but arguably it doesn't look amazingly good at the moment. But the problem is, Starmer can then fire back at Kemi Badenoch and say, well, hang on a minute. You guys literally just got out of office. You'd been in power for like a decade and a half, and now you're having a go at me over immigration when I've just picked up the ball that you guys were carrying for the past decade and a half. So what leg do you have to stand on? And lots of people kind of mentioned that it was almost playing into Farage's hands in a way. Kemi Badenoch says that Labour's bad on immigration. Labour goes, but your record on immigration was really bad. Who was Mr. We want less immigration, has been saying it consistently for absolutely ages and hasn't been the one in power making decisions about it? Oh, it was Nigel. And I think there's almost an element you can get with some people going, well, why not just vote for the genuine article? Why not vote for the thing that I feel is the purest form of the thing that I want, rather than something that I don't necessarily trust would even be implemented because I've seen the track record of the Tories previously. I think the Tories did a pretty good job in the 2010s of absorbing large swathes of what I would call the right-wing populist vote, the Brexit votes, the populist nationalist vote, however you want to put it. I think they did quite a good job for a while at absorbing that vote by taking on board some of those policies or embodying the idea that they were going to do Brexit. I think Boris Johnson in 2019 was quite good at harnessing that as well, although it certainly didn't hurt his chances that Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party, as it was known then, chose to stand down in the seats that the Tories were already incumbents in. I think if they had chose to run in that election, it probably would have had a bit of a spoiling effect for a number of those races. Would the Tories still have made it in with a majority? Probably, but it certainly would have been a lot tighter than it ended up being. So even back 5 years ago, I think the Nigel Farage political vehicle had a degree of influence on the outcome of the election. Certainly not to the same degree that we've now seen in 2024, where just look at the sheer number of places where they've come in second, look at the places where their vote share has shot up at the expense of the Tories coming down. Labour are in with a very big majority, but a fair amount of that has to do with the Tories just collapsing in terms of their support versus where they'd been in 2019. Excuse me. So, taking all of that into account then, can Reform win the next general election? Well, the most recent opinion polls that we've seen have, I'd say, about half of them have Labour out in front, just. About half of them have the Tories out in front, just. Most of them have Reform in third place, maybe 5 points or so behind whoever's in the lead. But in the past week, we've had something quite peculiar. And I am only talking about a handful of individual polls here, the usual caveats here. But we had a poll that had the Tories in front, with Reform in second and Labour in third. And then just recently now, we've also had a poll that's had Labour in front, with Reform in second and the Tories in third. So only a couple of polls, I know, but if we're saying that the thing that we can confirm at least is that the polling of the last few months has shown Reform in a fairly close third place behind the other two, certainly heads and shoulders above the Liberal Democrats, despite how many seats they have relative to Reform. And now you're starting to get a handful of polls here and there that have Reform in second place, one ahead of Labour, one ahead of the Tories. Is it that impossible to imagine that within the next few weeks even, we could see a poll that has Reform in first place, ahead of both the Tories and Labour? I don't think that's impossible. I think that's well within the realms of possibility. It's absolutely within the margin of error of some of the polls that have already come out that Reform could be doing that much better versus the other two. And I feel that for as long as, and this is quite important, I feel that for as long as Labour are not seen to be delivering on the things that voters want, be it improving people's standards of living and the economy, or indeed issues that matter more generally to the right-wing voters, such as controlling immigration. And for as long as the Tories and Kemi Badenoch are not able to recover the reputation of their party, for as long as they're not able to be seen as a more legitimate alternative to Nigel Farage and friends, I feel that for as long as that remains being the situation, for as long as Labour and the Tories actually continue to be fairly unpopular with not that many people enthused about them, certainly relative to the support that they used to enjoy in the past few decades, I think that's only going to end up benefiting Reform. Really, that's how I'm seeing things right now. I want to take a few comments real quick here. Apollo says, will people feel better off in 2029, though? Well, that's a key question. That is a key question, isn't it? Do you feel better off than you did at the time of the last election? It's the economy, stupid, as we always like to say. I voted for Genrick, wanted cleverly. Will probs join Reform, says Apollo TD. And this is Apollo TD, who has been one of my Tories here on the channel for God knows how long. And he's saying he'll probably join Reform. Tories failed on everything: NHS waiting lists, hospital building, immigration, defence size, taxes, growth, HS2. Only education was a success. Now, Apollo, I want to ask you this. As far as you thinking, okay, maybe I'll abandon the Tories now and go to the Reform, is it that you necessarily believe that Nigel Farage is going to do all the things that he says he's going to do? Or is it kind of that you've seen the track record of the Tories and you know that they've failed on the things that they said they were going to do, and you're kind of going, well, what's the harm? Fuck it, I'll give Farage and Reform a go. Surely they couldn't do any worse, or something like that. Frank says, there's already a poll that put Reform in the lead, Swiss, I'm sure, unless I'm severely mistaken. Hang on then, because I don't think I had seen a poll saying that. I think all the polls I've seen so far have had Reform in either second or third place. Yeah. From what I've got in front of me, I don't think we've had a poll with them in front recently. But I expect that I could quite easily be chatting to you guys in a week's time, or by the end of the year. And we go, oh, there we are. We've had our first poll that's had Reform in front. And I think that's an entirely tangible, possible thing to happen. So once more, coming back to the question, can Reform win the next general election? We like to bring it on back, don't we? I think it's possible. It's very, very hard for a third party to break through in our electoral system. It's also incredibly rare for a third party to come along and replace one of the two main parties. Obviously, in the 20th century, we had Labour come along, and ultimately Labour ended up replacing the Liberals as the main rival to the Tories. And then eventually you got the Liberals, the Social Democrats combining to the Lib Dems, and the Lib Dems kind of became our de facto third party for 30 odd years or so after their creation. But that kind of shows, in a sense, how rare it is and how difficult it is for another party to come along and supplant one of the main two. If you have, in the space of 100 years, it only happening once, you know? So that's fair enough to kind of say, well, look at history. Look at how difficult it is. Look at how that kind of stuff just doesn't happen. How could you say someone like Farage and Reform could come along and actually end up winning power or becoming one of the real big players in this country? And so that I'd say, because the conditions that would allow for something like that to happen, I think, are present. would it have been fathomable to you a few years ago to think that Reform would have 5 MPs in Parliament? Or that the Greens would have 4 MPs in Parliament? Thank you for correcting me there. Or that Labour would win 2/3 of the MPs on 1/3 of the votes? It's this increasing sort of sense of people not feeling that they want to or have to vote for the main two parties, that they're going to go for alternatives. And again, I say with this mood music of the past decade or so being actually people voting for more populist or anti-establishment options when they are presented to them and available. I think that it's almost going to be a bit of a perfect storm. I think that if we continue on down the road that we are presently on, and again, I will add a big, big caveat to that and say this is the road we are presently on. We've got another 4.5 years in all likelihood to go until the next general election. An awful lot of things can change. Kemi Badenoch may not be making waves at the moment, but maybe she will in the future. If you think about when Keir Starmer became leader of the opposition, for the first year or two under COVID, he couldn't get a word in edgeways. No one was paying any attention to him. It was only really when Partygate and Truss happened and the Tories imploded that people truly started looking at Starmer and going, right, okay, the Tories have shit the bed repeatedly now. Let's have a look at you, Labour. Are you scary socialist Jeremy Corbyn still, or are you plain Jane Keir Starmer? Oh, it's boring Keir. Okay, some of those wavering voters that maybe wouldn't have backed Labour under Corbyn would back them under Starmer. So maybe that would happen with Kemi Badenoch. But this is all ifs. This is all ifs and buts. So based on where we currently are, where the current trajectory appears to be, where we assume that things continue on as Labour are a disappointment in government and the Tories cannot get their base back, I think that only goes to benefit Reform. If people don't feel any better off in a few years' time, if you've still got high levels of immigration and high levels of illegal immigration over the channel as well, for that matter, that will continue to feed into it. Now, don't get me wrong. There are plenty of voters out there in the country that would never vote Reform. I don't think I'd ever vote Reform. I think that a large contingent of your more liberal types or your more left-wing types and who knows what else, they just wouldn't do it. But it's not really about winning over everyone. It's winning over enough people in enough places under a first-past-the-post electoral system. And yes, it's very hard for third parties to break through in a first-past-the-post electoral system. But I'd say that Reform have their hooks in. They didn't really, back when it was UKIP, they didn't have that kind of a footing. The only MP that they won in any election, UKIP, was in 2015. It was Douglas Carswell in Clacton, wasn't it? And he was previously a Tory MP who had defected to UKIP in a by-election and then subsequently stood for UKIP again and then won his seat. You didn't get a bunch of other UKIP MPs getting elected back then. This time round, you have. This time round, you've had a mix of Lee Anderson, who defected to Reform, getting re-elected. You've had other people brand new and fresh getting elected. You've had Nigel Farage back in Clacton again getting elected. But crucially, like I say, is that that large number of places that Reform are in second at the moment. That's really worth thinking about. And if you look at the polls at the moment, if we are going to assume that more or less, by and large, we end up in a place where actually Labour, the Tories and Reform are all sort of tied in the polls on roughly the same amount of support, roughly about 25% each or something like that. That really opens up things in our first past the post electoral system for some serious seismic changes. It then does start to seem a lot more possible that quite radical and surprising things can end up happening. Not least if, as I say, the two main parties fail in the next few years. Nigel Farage will be there, ready and waiting to say, I'm different, I'm a change. Brexit would have gone so much better if only I'd been in charge. We would have got that immigration down if only I'd been in charge. We would have successfully cut taxes and grown the economy or whatever if only I'd been in charge. All of that kind of stuff. And enough voters out there, I think, may end up going, well, yeah, we've had the Tories for God knows how long. We've had Labour just recently now. None of that really seems to be working for us. Maybe give them a try. I could see it happening. A few comments I want to read here. Apollo says, I don't believe Nigel will do what he says he will do, but I believe he could not do worse than the Tories, especially on immigration and defence. That is precisely the mindset I had assumed it would be. And yes, couldn't be any worse. We've tried the other guy. Give the other guy a chance. Screw it. You know, Dr. Zaya says Nigel Farage is going to listen to John Lennon's Imagine as he wins the election. Apollo says, I think Reform's ceiling is around 32 to 35%. The Tory floor is 15%. Reform lots have to realise that an informal pact is needed. And yeah, if, and it's a big if the Tories and Reform came to some kind of an agreement in an informal pact, and by informal pact, what I mean is it's not even they're standing aside for each other in certain seats. It could be as simple as saying, look, we are going to target this set of seats with more money and more campaigners and more people knocking on doors. You target that lot of seats with more money and campaigners and people knocking on doors. And we don't even have to pull people off of the ballot. But there'll be a general sense of saying, you know, this is your turf that you target Labour at. This is our turf that we will target Labour at. That would be enough to make life even more difficult for Labour right now. I mean, Christ, can you imagine a rerun of the general election just gone based on the current levels of support for the various parties? Not even imagining what could happen over the next 4 years, but just based on where things currently are right now. I think you'd have Labour with a great deal less seats. I think you'd probably have Reform with a decent little chunk more as well, for that matter. Apollo says, I think Reform's ceiling is around 32 to 35%. Tory floor is 15%. Reform. Oh, no, I read that one already. But what I wanted to add to that, when you say Reform's ceiling is around 32 to 35%, let's assume that's the case for a moment. And I would say, at the moment at least, it does seem a bit optimistic for Reform's chances if we were to say, oh, by the next election, Reform could get 35% or something. They're a good ways off that at the moment. However, let's say they reach their ceiling. Let's say they get to about a third of the votes. Well, who just won a large majority off the basis of a third of the vote? Oh, the Labour Party in the last election. Now, of course, different parts of the country, different demographics. You need to have a good ground game in certain areas. You can't just stack up votes in places that don't matter. But that's the way it goes under first past the post. You don't need to bring most of the country with you. You can even potentially afford not to bring 2/3 of the country with you. As long as you have a third of the voters in the right places, you can still make your way into power. Apollo says, also, Reform supporters like Sargon need to realise that Tommy Robinson is not a winning message and that Farage needs to shut up to win, like Starmer did in opposition. I've not watched Sargon in a number of years, so I don't have much to say on Sargon specifically. Although I will say this, which I find interesting. There are parts of the online political sphere that I poke my head into every now and then just to see what they're saying. And I would describe some of these people as being probably what we would term as being the far right. And funnily enough, what the more far right types say of Farage these days is, oh, Farage has sold out. Farage isn't going hard enough on this issue or that issue. Farage should be saying, let's deport all the immigrants or whatever. You know, Farage should be echoing more of a Trump-like rhetoric, where, you know, that kind of thing. It's interesting to me that from what I've seen, some of the more extreme end of the Reform support spectrum actually seem to be quite unhappy with Farage at the moment. What that suggests to me is that whatever Farage is doing in terms of his messaging, if he's pissing off the people on the more extreme end, he's probably bringing in more people towards just the regular old centre-right or right-wing. That tends to be the way of it. You piss off one end, you're bringing in people on the other side. A bit like Starmer, you know, pissed off a bunch of the left-wing voters, but hey ho, he got the people he needed to in the end. So that's just something worth thinking about as well. Apollo CD says, Swiss, do you think Starmer will be ousted like Kevin Rudd was in 2010 if Labour starts polling consistently second and third? That's a good question, Apollo. I'm not entirely sure. I don't think Labour. I don't think Starmer's in any danger at the moment. I can't see him being ousted like, within the next year or whatever. I think there's enough people minded to say give him a crack of the whip, let him go on for a bit longer, see what comes of his project for government and his leadership. But maybe once you start getting to kind of mid-parliament time, if Labour's inconsistently, say, third place, then you might start seeing people getting a little bit trigger happy and going, oh, with the writings on the wall where things are going to end up at the next election, maybe we should swap him out for someone else. Now, obviously, the form tends to be for the Tories to be the ones ousting their leaders and all the rest of it. But you can't. I wouldn't totally write it off. I wouldn't say it's impossible or anything like that. All I'll say is that I think Starmer's pretty darn safe for the next couple of years at least. So it's not really on my radar as a thing that I'm thinking about right now, because I don't think anything's likely to happen there for a good while. Oh, excuse me, I've got a horrible cold at the moment. Dr. Zayas says Wes Streeting is plotting. So finally, to round off the video then, can Reform win the next general election? It's crunch time. It's time for me to try and finally answer the question. All right. Can they win the next general election? Yes. Yes, they can. And I don't mean that in a bullshit kind of technicality sort of way where you go, I don't know, can the Greens win the next general election? And you go, well, if enough people and enough seats vote for the Greens, then there's no reason why they can't. I'm talking about realistically here, Can Reform win the general election? Yes, they can. Will they win the next general election? That will depend. That will depend on how Labour and the Tories do. I think the thing with Farage is it's easier in a way for him to make mistakes and to say the wrong thing, and he bounces back a lot more easily from it. He's got that kind of Teflon quality that Boris Johnson had for a while until Partygate and all the rest of it, or that the likes of Donald Trump has in America. There are certain people that have certain kind of messages that appeal to a certain kind of base that actually you can come out with some pretty outrageous things, and to most of the voters backing you, it doesn't really matter if the things that you say are outrageous or if you get this thing wrong or that thing wrong, because it's the overall core feel and the thrust of it, and it being something different from what the other things are. And okay, it's a bit like me in a way when I was a Jeremy Corbyn guy a few years back. He's not perfect. He's got a few rough edges that need rounding off, but we're that desperate for change. I want to see him in at any cost versus the other people. That was my mindset on it at the time, and I can totally see that being the mindset of people backing Reform and Farage at the moment as well. So can it happen? Yes. Will it happen? That will depend. However, based on our current trajectory, I think it's potentially more likely than not. Now, final thing to say. Winning the next election, are we talking about them getting a majority and being in as a party of just them in government? Are we talking about a minority government? Are we talking about them being the junior partner in a coalition or the senior partner in a coalition with the Tories in all likelihood? Something like that. That I'm less certain of. That it's easy for me to sort of say, look, I think this is the direction of travel. I think that they're going to do pretty darn well for themselves in a few years' time, if all things being equal, carry on the way that they are now. But 4.5 years out, it is inadvisable for me to start trying to pin down particular numbers of seats and electoral maths and all that sort of stuff, because I think that is unwise. I've got a general sense of a movement, looking at the polls, going where could they be headed, looking at the parties and saying how are they performing. I'm not yet going to be drawn into saying I think that this party will get 180 seats and that party will get 220 seats and all the rest of it. But you know what? If I'm going to, at this very early stage in this parliament, throw out a prediction, and one that I will stick myself to, unless events come along and change it, but certainly this is where I think we are at the moment, I will say this. I think that after the next general election, Nigel Farage and Reform will be in government. There we are. And that covers me. That covers all the bases pretty well. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a majority. It could be a coalition. It could be a number of different things. But I think they will have crossed that threshold where they will get there. And the final thing I'll say to that as well, even if it seems at the moment very unlikely and very a party of 5 MPs at 20% in the polls, how on earth do you think that a party of 5 MPs at 20% in the polls could end up in government in a few years' time? Because believe it or not, guys, we live on the banter timeline where for the better part of the last decade, all of the things that seem quite unexpected and unlikely to happen, oh no, that would never happen, a lot of the time, or at least more than half of the time, they do happen. And afterwards we go, oh, who saw that coming? Oh, well, I guess it was so obvious in retrospect that this and this meant that this crazy thing that no one saw coming ultimately ended up happening. I think I've finally come round to the idea of, okay, these things that seem a bit unfathomable from a certain point in time, by the time we get to them, actually, yeah, they're pretty darn fathomable by then. So there we are. This is me in a sense. I just wanted to set out this opinion nice and early. I've been thinking about it for the past couple of weeks, but I think after seeing a couple of polls in the past week, after watching Farage on Question Time and seeing the interaction with him and various how much the audience was for him or against him and all sorts of little things like that, I thought, you know what? It's finally time for me to make this stream and sort of, pin my opinions up there and say, look, this is what I'm noticing. This is where I think that we're heading. I think that populist energy is still out there. I think that if the main parties just are not managing to deliver on the things that voters want from them, I think that because people are willing to vote for alternatives so much more, I could see it happening. I could see it happening. Do I think it's a certainty? Absolutely not. Do I think it's more likely than not? At the moment, yes, I do. Even if currently they've got 5 MPs, even if currently they're only at 20-something% in the polls, even if currently they don't have that many councillors around the country or whatever, this is now. I'm talking about in 4 years' time. And if I'm going to make an educated guess about where it appears things will end up in a few years' time based on where they are at the moment and how I can expect them to go, if people don't feel any better off, if immigration is still at record levels, if the Tories haven't managed to capitalise on Labour not doing too well and winning back some of their voters from Reform, that's where I can see things going, to be totally honest with you. So there we are. That's what I wanted to do, folks. I have spoken for so much longer than I thought I would. I was anticipating this maybe being a 20-minute video, just setting out those thoughts. And obviously, I've waffled on for ages. I've gone into a bit more detail than I'd maybe anticipated. But I wanted to get that out there and say that to you. So I would be very interested to you guys here in the chat right now, or anyone watching this video after the fact in the comments. Do you agree with me? Do you agree with me that you think it will happen? Or do you accept or agree that maybe it's a possibility? Do you think I'm way, 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 way off? And right now, this represents a high watermark for Reform, and actually it's a bit more of a flash in the pan right now. Sure, there's a bit of buzz about them. Sure, we've had a couple of polls where they're doing quite well, but actually, Labour start to deliver on the things they want to do, and things are looking a lot better for them. Maybe Kemi Badenoch beds in a bit better, and she takes advantage of Labour not doing too well, and things end up going better for her. Maybe something happens. Maybe Farage gets hit by a bus. I don't know. Maybe you think that I'm way off. I'm interested to hear whether you either agree with me or disagree with me, and what your reasons are for thinking that as well. And finally, I'll say Igneous has just said way off. I just don't think Brits are that stupid. I will say this, Igneous. And by the way, I'm not saying this in terms of characterizing people as being stupid. But again, from my observations over the past decade or so, and talking about the unlikely things ending up happening, I've also noticed a pattern with the things that are described by their opponents as being the stupid thing. There's no way the country would be stupid enough to vote to leave the EU. There's no way the country would be stupid enough to make Boris Johnson prime minister. You know, this kind of stuff. Well, it happens. I don't think anyone is or isn't stupid enough for anything. And I'm not saying, by the way, that people who would vote for reform are stupid. In fact, I think that if anything, we really, really need to, especially if you're, whatever your politics is, right? Say you don't want Farage and Reform in power. Say it is the last thing you want, whether you want the Tories in instead, whether you want Labour in instead, whether you're much more left wing, it doesn't matter. But say you just more than anything, you do not want to see Farage and Reform in power. I would start off at the very beginning by stopping referring to people who support that stuff as being stupid or tricked or fooled or easily deceived or just having innately bad intentions. Because we've seen that being done time and time again. We've seen it being done with the people who voted for Brexit. We've seen it being done with the sort of people who support Jeremy Corbyn. We've seen it being done with people voting for Donald Trump over in the States. You can see it with various populist things all across the political spectrum in different countries. That thing of characterizing something, and I'm not having a pop at you, by the way, Ignace. This was a point I wanted to come onto and I'd totally forgotten about. But that kind of characterization of something as the only reason someone would vote for it is because either they're stupid or they've been deceived or they're just innately bad people. I think more than anything, that speaks to a misunderstanding of why people would be voting for the thing that they're voting for. And not least, it also isn't helpful in the slightest at winning people over to your side of the argument at all. It's better to say, I agree with your concerns, but yes, I accept that these people have done a terrible job. However, or yes, I understand how, this particular movement or whatever have some really good things that they're saying. But on the other hand, rather than just sort of, oh, you fucking idiot, you're supporting them? You deserve what you get. I think we've seen enough of that and how much that really doesn't work in the past decade. So I think yeah. That's all I'll say on that for the time being, anyway. All right, then, folks. Thank you very much. I appreciate you joining me for this stream. If you found it interesting, why not give it a like or a share? And your final reminder, go and vote for your nominations in the Milky Awards. They close on Friday, and then we'll be through to the next stage. I'll catch you all later on. Ta-ta.